My name is Bret Alderman, and I am a writer inspired by Jung and with a mythopoetic sensibility.
Hello and welcome to Spokes. I'm Colette Colfer and I'm here today at the introduction with
Terry Hackett.
Terry is the co-producer and he's not usually audible in these episodes, but he's always there doing the editing and the mixing. So we just decided to come outside and walk in some of the fields around where we live, just to give you an idea of the sounds and the scenes in the countryside in Ireland. We're in June. We're not in full lockdown at the moment, but there are still restrictions in place. So this means that we can't meet people to record them face to face. So we're still doing online recordings, which of course does have the advantage that we can talk to people from all over the world.
Remote recordings.
Remote recordings. Today's episode features a person who is in California. It is Dr. Bret Alderman. He is a writer and a life coach, and the main topic of conversation today is his book, which is called Symptom, Symbol and the Other of Language. It's a book that really focuses on what is called the linguistic turn that happened in the 20th century, which was an increased focus on language. And the impact of that focus on language was, in a way, a kind of a neglect of the body. He means, when he's talking about the body, it's the animate body. The animate body is a body that has soul, and also a neglect, in a way, of nature. So we hope you enjoy this episode. I began the conversation with Bret by asking him about his job as a life coach.
In my case, it's really close to psychotherapy, although sometimes it's a little bit closer to what people think of when they think of a life coach, which is, you have certain goals in mind and you want to talk them through with someone else who might be able to give you a few tips as to how to achieve them and kind of bring out your full potential, and also check in on what actions you've claimed that you're going to take to achieve those goals. And so there's a lot of overlap with psychology and therapy, although they are two different animals, but I tend to blur the boundaries quite a bit in my work.
So with people coming to you, would they already know their goals, or is it about helping them to figure out what the goals are as well?
It's a little bit of both. And sometimes what happens is that they'll come to me for coaching, and the more they talk to me, the more they realize, well, what I really want is something closer to psychotherapy. And at which point I say, well, we can do something that's closer to psychotherapy.
And then that influences their goals, I guess, then when
Sure.
They find out about themselves.
Yeah. I mean, one of the great things about coaching is that you realize that when people have certain goals, the obstacles to those goals often turn out to be very meaningful and almost sort of valuable when you can really start to drill down on them. Like, oh, that's interesting that particular obstacle showed up in your life at that particular moment. Like, I wonder why that, and then it's a way of sort of opening a magical door into like a whole other aspect of what's going on in them. So.
Wow. So is the obstacle, in a way, can it be, I don't know if I'm understanding it correctly, but is the obstacle, can it be a way of redirecting the person to another goal? Is that?
Well, it can be. It can be, or it can also give a whole other dimension of why the goal is even there to begin with, why it's meaningful. And so I'm finding a lot of really great overlap between depth psychology and Jung psychology and coaching. So that's pretty fun because, in Jung psychology, of course, any obstacle to a goal is something that's might have a purpose. It might be trying to get you to stop to really take a look at something. It might not just be asking you to do that. It might insist upon it until you really stop and look at what's going on.
Could you give us an example of that?
I'm trying to think of an example that's not directly from one of my coaching clients, because that would not be.
What about from your own life?
From my own life, I would say, and this is directly related actually to the book and so many other things that we'll probably talk about today, but I wanted to write for the longest time, and I wanted to write novels. And I had the hardest time, and I would start drafts, and I got as far as maybe 18, 20 pages of a novel, and it just wouldn't go anywhere. And I'd have all these great ideas, but they never really came to fruition. It was very frustrating, and I was in this state for years. And I kept on having these recurrent dreams that told me that I had to go back to school. And I found them annoying as hell. I was just like, another one of these effing dreams. God damn it. And it felt like that idea of going back to school was just an annoyance, because I was pretty clear that I didn't want to. I didn't really have a lot of faith in academia. And so my conscious perspective was, no, I'm not going to go back. The dreams were so insistent that, knowing what I knew of Jung's thinking, I knew that, okay, well, I have to at least explore the possibility. There's maybe something here that I'm just not understanding. So I went ahead and I applied at a school, and I got accepted. And then even at that point, I thought, well, I'm just going to go to the first couple classes and see if I really want to go through with this. And I went ahead and I did it. The interesting thing was that as soon as I was accepted to that school, and I was given essays to write, assignments, the writing just flowed, and I was just in the groove. I was writing one essay after another, and they were works that I was proud of. And so looking back, I was understanding that idea of going back to school as an obstacle, when in fact it was
the opposite.
Here I am talking with you about a book I wrote. So,
what the school, when you went back to the school, was that what course was it that you did?
Well, I went to get my master's and later my PhD in depth psychology at the Pacifica Graduate Institute.
Right.
Yeah.
So when we say depth psychology, that's Jungian, right?
It's Jungian, it's Freudian, it's a way of saying any psychology that takes seriously the idea of the unconscious.
Okay.
In my case, that's a lot of Jung and a lot of post-Jungian thinkers. That's my strength, my forte, my interest.
Yeah. So to get to the book, I think the name of the book is Symptom, Symbol, and the Other of Language, a Jungian interpretation of the linguistic turn. I think, to break it down, like, a key idea in the book is the importance of the body, would you say?
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about that, or how did you come to that?
I'm going to have to kind of backtrack and go to ideas that precede that to make that make sense. Yeah, I hope that's okay. So there's this really prevalent idea in this movement called the linguistic turn, which I can define at some point if you like, that language is meaningful, and language is meaningful because of the way one word relates to another, relates to another, relates to another. That words like light and dark, male and female, up and down, wet and dry, have meaning by virtue of the way they relate to one another. So the what is kind of left out of that vision is the way that all of those words might be meaningful by virtue of something that you actually live or experience, right? So, I mean, okay, the word light has a certain meaning because of its relation to the word dark. I mean, that kind of makes sense. You need some sort of opposition there. But it also makes sense that right now, where I'm at, I can look outside my window and I can see the light playing on the blinds. And there's an actual, like, visceral, sensate experience of light. And I just thought, well, that has to inform our sense of, like, the meaning of that word. That has to come into play somewhere. So I thought, well, okay, but it's not, I'm not seeing it come into play with these thinkers. They seem to be leaving that out. So I'm just thinking to myself, what are they leaving out? Well, they're leaving out the sensate body, the experiential body, the immediacy of sensual experience. So that's kind of where that started to come in. Does that answer the question without getting too...
It does. And then we go back to maybe you explaining when you say about the linguistic turn. What do you mean by that?
Good question. I mean, that's a really good place to start. So the linguistic turn is this really big player, big actor on the stage of 20th century thought, 20th and 21st century thought. And it was a term coined by Gustav Bergman in 1953, and later the term linguistic turn was popularized by a philosopher named Richard Rorty in a book by that same name. And it sort of alludes to this pervasive shift in Western philosophy and humanities and social sciences, in which there was a growing acceptance of the idea that language, rather than merely describing or reflecting the world, actually creates it, actually creates our sense of what's real and what's true and what's beautiful. So before the turn, I mean, in kind of simplistic terms, the idea was that our words sort of reflect some sort of pre-existing reality. You see the light outside the window, you learn that there's this word that you can use, light, that will in some way represent that thing you're seeing, and that's how language works. Well, the linguistic turn comes along and says, no, it's not that simple. In fact, it's really, really quite complicated, but once we tease apart all the complications, what we see is that the relationship is reversed. It's actually the word light or dark or, male, female, whatever, that's creating, in a sense, what you believe to be true. It's a really interesting philosophical inversion. That's, somebody who's a real expert in the field might say that's a heck of a simplification, and it is. But, if you want to get farther in the weeds, I think that's why you spend years of your life reading people like Derrida and Foucault like I do, but it's not an easy trek.
Do you enjoy reading them?
No, I can't stand it. I'm really looking forward to finishing this next book, because I've got another one that I'm hoping to have out next year.
Oh wow! You have to tell us about that, can you?
I will, but I'm convinced. I'm telling myself, once this one is out, I am writing about something so entirely different. I don't want to hear anything about linguistic signs and reference and Derrida and Foucault and Richard Rorty and all of these guys. I'm tired of semiotics and all of their, I'm tired of that.
But they're so popular. When you talk about the linguistic turn, then, does that connect into the idea of things as being socially constructed?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you think of language, language is a set of constructs. And I think the linguistic turn really did so much to promote this idea, this focus on language and language as a set of constructs. And it, at the same time, it did a great deal to undermine the idea that these constructs refer to something beyond themselves. So let's say, to touch a hot button issue, the words male and female, well, the words in and of themselves, you could say, are constructs. And I think it's okay to think of the words themselves as constructs, but it's also good to remember that those constructs refer to this sort of reality that we can all see and that biology has a lot to say about. So, this sense of things being just constructs, I think, has a lot to do with the linguistic turn and the focus on things like semiotics.
Right. So the linguistic turn and language is, and in the book you talk about this, the cleavage of ideas from nature, from the earth. Is that right? Have I got it right?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I do it in kind of a strange roundabout way, I think, because I tried to use kind of an associative logic in the book. It's not really a straight-ahead philosophical argument. I mean, I rely upon that a bit, but I also just try to play with images and play with words. And, one of the key ideas in a lot of these thinkers that are part of the linguistic turn, and particularly people like Foucault and Derrida and people who are what you would call post-structuralists and structuralists, they take issue with the idea of nature and human nature. And so I was thinking about that, thinking, what on earth, why would that be? And what does that mean? And sort of not just letting my rational mind think it through, but also sort of playing with images. And I looked up the etymology of the word nature, and it happened to be that nature comes from the Latin natus, which is place of birth. And then I thought, well, great, where's our place of birth? Well, our place of birth is the earth. And then I just started kind of going down this sort of associative, this line of associations, and thought, well, gosh, if you're denying nature and human nature, then in some sense you're denying the earth itself, right? And then I started thinking of other metaphors that kind of go through all of these thinkers, and a lot of these thinkers are called post-foundationalists, and they talk about how our truth claims aren't grounded. Well, then I thought, well, what's ground? Well, ground is the earth. And what's foundation? Foundation is the earth. And then I just started letting all of those associations inform my critique, which is exactly the type of thing that you want to do if you take Carl Jung's thinking seriously. You want to allow yourself, I think, this is what I was trying to do, approach certain intellectual ideas as if they were psychological complexes, and approach them also as if they were like dream symbols, and sort of allow myself to say, well, what on earth does that mean? and not just in sort of this explicit sort of philosophical sense of like, okay, let's dissect these ideas and see whether or not they make sense and we can refute the arguments. I wanted to do a little bit of that, but do a lot more, and also say, well, what dream is being dreamt here? Like what images and feelings and sensations and intuitions come up when I read some of the ideas that these thinkers put forth? I got way off topic. I don't even know what the question was that originated that response.
No, that's perfect. But can I just follow it on with that? Well, what was your intuition then? I think in the beginning of the book, you call it a book of mythopoetic imagination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and I read over that sentence a good few times, and I was thinking about it like, so mythopoetic, you're bringing myth into it.
Yeah.
There's also poetry in it.
Sure.
And when you say imagination, the imagination as being something that's separate or, you know, in opposition to the rational side of the brain, is it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, but what you said there about where did your intuition lead on that then? Why was the linguistic turn, or what's going on? I know you're going to have to simplify it maybe, but...
Well, so like there's this one particular idea that's really prevalent in the turn that I wanted to like keep coming back to. It was kind of like the central image or symbol that I wanted to keep interpreting. And that's this idea of language as being kind of insular, like one word, what I was describing before, one word refers to another, refers to another, refers to another. There's all this emphasis on language as construct and no sense of how it relates to anything that you might actually live or experience or see or sense or touch. And so, you know, thinking of that idea, then like my imagination, immediately I see something like a head floating like 10 feet above a body. Like there's just like a weird disconnect, you know, like I can literally imagine a head talking and it's like floating disconnected from an actual human body. I mean, from one perspective, that's just some weird surrealistic image. But if you study depth psychology, you think, well, but there's meaning there. And so, you know, for me, that image speaks of a dissociation. Okay, dissociation between language-bearing intellect and physical, visceral body, sensing, feeling, touching, seeing, intuiting. So that's where my mythopoetic imagination takes me. And then once I started thinking about that, well, I think, well, the disconnect goes even farther. You know, then it's a bit like that image leads me to an astronaut who's flying far above the Earth, you know, disconnected from that environment that we all spring from, right? The Earth as the milieu that we inhabit. And, you know, then I just kind of kept going with this sort of mythopoetic way of approaching these ideas, and kind of tried to toggle back to the ideas in and of themselves, you know, putting forth basic theory, basic understanding of, you know, structuralist language theory and post-structuralism and deconstruction, and but kind of going back and forth.
It really works. But I want to ask you, were you surprised yourself by the images that did come up?
Yeah, I was. I was also surprised at how well they worked together. You know, they just... I mean, I cite a lot someone who was actually one of my teachers at Pacifica, Robert Romanician, and he wrote a book that's, you know, been republished many, many times, called Technology, a Symptom and Dream. And he uses, a lot of those images that I also refer to, of a corpse and an astronaut and things like that. And so when I started working with those images, I was really surprised how well they related to images and ideas I was seeing in deconstruction and post-structuralism and this sort of radical postmodernism that that he didn't write about. And it was so Robert Romanetian, right, who I'm drawing these images from, his imagery worked really well with what I was talking about, but he had never wrote about those authors at all.
Okay, he hadn't made the same connections that you had.
He hadn't made the same connections, but I was lucky enough to be able to send him the book, and he read it, and he said, "Oh my God, it all makes perfect sense, doesn't it?" Which of course is all. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, one of the ones that really struck me is at the very beginning of the book when you have Vesalius in the year, was it 1543? Around then, and he is cutting open the cadaver, the body, the corpse, and then you kind of superimpose it in a way, or you make a parallel connection with Saussure and him and his diagram, the oval with the line going across and the signifier signified, and that was really powerful.
Oh, I'm glad.
The parallel there.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that, because it felt really powerful when I first came across it, but then trying to make it work intellectually and trying to really explain what I meant by that parallel took me a lot of work, and it's good to hear that it makes sense to other people. But basically I tried to just say that, there's a certain way that we started to look at the human body. We started to look at it as an anatomical object, as this thing that had a particular structure that we could literally dissect. And that was not something that people always did. I mean, it's really part of this sort of it's part of modernity. It's part of a particular ideal of objectivity. And we didn't always look at physical bodies as objects to be understood. Just like right now I'm looking at you, and I'm not thinking of this as an object to be understood. I'm thinking of this as a subject to be understood. There's a person that I'm relating to. So that shift in looking at a somebody as just a body, as a someone that I can relate to, is now we're going to understand that someone as like a physical object. I can see how it works. Even saying it, it's like a different shift in looking at bodies. So, I mean, to get back to what we were talking about, I think something similar took place in the way we approach language, where Saussure started to look at language as this object that could be dissected and pulled apart, and we could see how it works. But it's a very particular way at looking at language that's not. It's important to know what you're doing when you decide to dissect or deconstruct language. Because you're really looking at language in a particular way. If you're not aware that you're doing that, you can build up these huge blind spots in your perspective. I hope I'm making sense. Yeah.
No, you are making sense. One thing that struck me in the book that when you were talking about Derrida was about language and how he looks at it all at the one time. I think, is there in a sense that he doesn't trace backwards? So it's about what the words mean now. Like you talked about nature, and nature is connected to the Latin natus.
Right.
Yeah. Where I think Derrida wouldn't do that. Is that right? Would he look at that way?
He definitely looks at etymology. So he does do that. He traces words back in that way. But he's a strange one, because he works on the assumption that all of the distinctions that we're making in language none of them are based on anything self-evident. all of it is part of this sort of metaphysical heritage. That's his terms, that we just sort of inherit, but they're not really based on anything to begin with. So, to go back to the words we've used before, light and dark, day and night, wet and dry, these are all terms we've inherited, but we haven't inherited them because there's something in experience that just makes them self-evident. So he sort of dissociates language from this sort of extra referential field. It's kind of weird. So he almost, when he's tracing back etymology in the same way that I do, he always arrives at a place where there's just nothing. It's like language is founded on an abyss.
Right. So words referring to other words, to other words, to other words, as opposed to that connection between, you talk about the animate body. Mm-hmm. So the body that's animate is the body that is filled with soul or life.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, okay. And it's a wonderful word to focus on. I mean, we usually think of animate as being something that's moving, but the word comes from the Latin anima, which means soul, and animus, which means spirit, and an animate human being, a being that is moving, is a being that's still alive. And a non-animate body is it's a corpse. It's a dead body. And it's I forgot. Can you repeat what you just said? How did I get here?
About the animate, the lived body. Now I can't remember exactly.
Yes, yeah. So I think that term animate body speaks to the experiential body that in some way is. You have to relate to it to understand why language is meaningful. Okay, so the term grief, of course, gains something of its meaning by virtue of its relation to words like happiness and joy. Of course, that's kind of this constructed element of it. But it also has everything to do with my experience of grief, right? When I got divorced, I cried like a baby for several months. And that experience, that visceral, gut-wrenching feeling informs what I understand that word grief to mean. And I think what deconstruction does and post-structuralism does is it rends that connection between visceral experience or visceral perception and the construct, right? And so it that's what I keep trying to get at, because I feel like there's something so dissociated there. There's something so just like there's a psychological split there. That's what I keep sensing.
Okay, and the next question is a big one then. It's why has that happened, do you think?
Yeah, that's a huge question. In part of it's because of our incredible success. We're such a successful species, and we can create really comfortable lives for ourselves. And we have all these ways of avoiding pain and suffering and making things comfortable. And that in itself, I think, leads to a situation in which we can be sort of dissociated, and we can get by with it. Dissociation, I always think as a way of responding to and not quite necessarily feeling difficult feelings like anxiety or depression or rage or whatever. Whatever there might be at the heart of a psychological complex. Well, dissociation is there because it allows us not to feel that, right? And it's part of the purpose. That's part of why we dissociate. That's part of the reason why, to use a really graphic example, sometimes when people are being raped, they'll actually see what's going on as if they were outside of their body. They're splitting off from the experience because it's just too atrocious, right? So there's a dissociation there. And so that's just a natural part of being human, the ability to dissociate when something's painful. But there seems to be something in the nature of the way we're living now where I think that can become kind of a constant state.
Is it dangerous? Is it bad?
Yes. Yes. I mean,
and why?
You can be a person looking at your iPhone, walking across the street and being sort of split off from everything that's happening around you, but eventually you're going to get hit by a car. I mean, it's like people have to be embedded within their surroundings in some way just to function, and increasingly we're able not to do that. But you can only do that up to a point. So let me give you an example. We're increasingly spending more and more time looking at screens and becoming transfixed by the words and the images upon the screens, so much so that becomes our primary reality, and we lose any sense of the way our feet feel touching the ground or the floor, or the way our back feels, or whether or not we're breathing deeply, or any sort of emotion. So we're sort of split off from our bodies and entranced by what we're seeing on a screen. But that's not a viable way to live. That's just not what we evolved to do. It's just...
Do you think it's going to change, though? I mean, we're heading into an era, you mentioned about cyborgs in the book, and I think you say post-humanism, but also there's the idea of transhumanism, where we become mixed in with the technologies. And I always wonder, I wonder if we're even already there, because like you said, people are walking down the street with their phones in their hands. Mm-hmm. So we're already kind of almost a mix in a way. But is there we're not going to be going back. We're going to be going forward. So what can happen? What's the next steps? What can we do?
It's a scary proposition. I mean, you and I are speaking right now with headphones on, so we're already like one step closer to being these sort of hybrid creatures. But it's not an all or nothing proposition. We can find, I hope, reasonable, sensible ways of interacting with technology, and even using it perhaps to enhance our physical bodies. We already do. But I like to think that we can do that in such a way that doesn't go off the deep edge. I mean, some of the people who are post-humanists or transhumanists, really do think that someday you'll be able to just transfer the content of your thinking onto a computer, and that will actually represent some sort of eternal life, as if just because the information that you've gained is somehow going to continue after your body does not, that means that you'll be immortal. Now that's insane. That is, to me, is absolutely insane. But
right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the minute you start talking about that and immortality, I think of gods, and you bring that idea in as well. So is it a question, like you use the myth of Prometheus,
mm-hmm.
and about trying to take the power away from the idea of there being a transcendent, so that it's the humans and the ego that becomes all important in a way. Is that right?
Yeah. And which, I think it's something that's playing out in a lot of different areas. And in the book, I focus on how it's playing out within postmodernism, but you can see how closely some of those postmodern ideas also relate really well to, for example, posthumanism and transhumanism and the cyborg, and what have you. But so I think, for example, in post-structuralism and deconstruction, there's this idea that reality is just a construct. Everything that we're experiencing and is really just constructed. Well, therefore, we can change the constructions and change reality. Really, I mean, it's all within our power. Just find a new word to describe something, and now something's fundamentally changed. And that's a myth with a grain of truth to it. But if you're stuck in that myth and you're really thinking that humans are these godlike creatures that can construct reality, you're in for a pretty brutal awakening, because there is something that you would call objective reality that doesn't give a bleep about your linguistic constructions. Mm-hmm. It's like I tweeted the other day that you can deconstruct gravity, but you're still going to fall on your face if you don't pay attention to it,
You mentioned in the book about pain can bring us back in a way to the body.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think having had a child, I think going through labor and giving birth is such a grounding experience. It's very, you're here.
Yeah.
And I suppose the other danger is the idea that we create other gods. I mean, I'm not saying that any one god or idea of God is necessarily important, but then do we create things that become our gods?
Yeah. And to me, this makes perfect sense in terms of Jung's psychology. It's really at the point when you think you are completely self-determined, that you are completely in control of yourself and your life and everything. It's really at that moment that psyche or life will find a way of showing you you're not. It's when you feel most self-possessed that you're going to be possessed by something that feels like it comes completely outside of you. So it's at the moment when we feel godlike that at that very moment we start to be possessed by something that Jung would call a god. He and that people might want to understand that metaphorically. He's not making a theological argument. He's saying that what other generations called gods, those things are still with us, and they still have the same power over us as they did before. Perhaps they even have more power because we're so convinced that they don't exist.
And will they come back in then?
They already are. I mean, they already are. How many of us are ruled by compulsion, by addiction, by symptoms in our lives that we can't understand and just keep coming back? I mean, you look at people, and people are nobody's as free and autonomous and in control as they might appear to be. I think we're all sort of at times struggling probably more possessed than we would like to believe, if that makes any sense.
Right. And is there a way to become conscious of that?
Sure. I mean, you listen to your dreams. You listen to strange coincidences in your life. You listen to the symptoms of your body. You know, that's a lot of depth psychology really started with that. I mean, it started with people like Freud, who would like have a patient who was suffering from paralysis. And, you know, the patient had already gone through all of the scientific tests that they had at the time. There was no organic cause. They couldn't figure out why this patient was paralyzed. And so Freud had the brilliant idea of listening to the person's story, listening to what the person had lived recently. And in this particular case that I'm thinking about, well, she had just lost her fiancé. Her fiancé died. Well, what did she do with her fiancé? She went on long walks with her fiancé, and they were romantic and beautiful and meant so much to her. And then all of a sudden, life took that experience away from her. And so then she became paralyzed. She couldn't walk anymore. So you can see the sort of symbolic echo of that traumatic experience. That's symbolism. That's understanding the psyche through symptom and symbol. Doing things like that help you to be in right relationship with forces that are beyond yourself. So let me ground that a little bit more. Had Freud and his patient not gone through that understanding and seeing how what was really happening was that there was this experience of grief that was so profound that it was difficult to deal with, had they not understood it symbolically and seen that in effect there was almost like a god at work that was overpowering this person, they would not have been able to transcend the paralysis. I'm not sure if...
But how did they transcend it? Was it just enough to acknowledge and recognize it?
Well, and to have that followed up with the emotional catharsis, you know, to feel it. I mean, if you just recognize something purely intellectually and the felt experience isn't there, then you're back in the area of dissociated language.
Wow, yeah. So it's like it ties in with what you were saying earlier about the experiences of some people when they're being raped, they go outside of their bodies. Yeah. So to dissociate from the body. So it's the importance of being in the body and feeling. And I think in the book you talk about the death of instinct. Not the death of instinct, but that instinct is very much something there's the intellect on one side and the instinct which comes from within the body. It's not necessarily made of words.
Right.
Is that right?
And this is classic Jung. It's also, you know, classic Freud. I mean, my differences about what he thought those instincts were, but he has that basic idea too. And I think how you see it playing out in something like deconstruction and postmodernism is that they would say, well, no, what you're calling instinct is really just a cultural inheritance. It's just a bit of language. It's just an idea, but there's no instinct there. You know, that's just something that we've kind of made up. And someone like Jung would say, oh, no. Don't go down that road. That's a dangerous idea. We have to continually come back to our animal selves, to our feeling selves, to our to our physical bodies, our sensing bodies.
You mention in the book as well that like mythos and logos. Am I pronouncing logos right? Anyway, that the logos is connected to the intellect, and the mythos is more, if I understand it correctly, connected to the nature side of things. Is that right? Or maybe that's what I put on it.
I think that's how it's playing itself out. There's a real disconnect between the two, the mythos and the logos, and God, these are huge questions.
It reminds me, I teach world religions, and in Hinduism, the difference in Purusha and Prakriti. And Prakriti is nature, earth, and Purusha is spirit. And Purusha is associated with the male, the masculine, and Prakriti, or the earth, is associated with the feminine. And I think you kind of touch on this in the book a little bit as well, that it's, to my mind, kind of a masculine energy, the intellect and the rationale. Yeah. And that while maybe feminists might argue for more power and for more positions of power in the world, I often think actually that's the masculine energy. I'll be given out to for saying that maybe, but that the nature and what's lacking is the feminine, but that sometimes people are complaining about the patriarchy by being patriarchal in a way.
Yeah. I think you're really onto something, and it's a little bit difficult for me to talk about it, I think, because I'm so well aware of, this sort of critique of the very ideas of the masculine and the feminine, and kind of third generation feminists who I think make arguments like the ones you just alluded to. But I think you're right. There is a way of being in the world that I would call masculine that I think is being hyper-emphasized. And as a result, what I would call the feminine is being utterly left behind. And I don't mean those terms in this really reductive way where like, oh, the feminine is something that you have and I don't, and I have the masculine. And, I'm not trying to invoke these stereotypes and saying that they're truths. Not at all. But there's a way of being in the world that I would call feminine that I think is being utterly left behind by, by just about everyone, really.
It's not about male, female, as in it's not necessarily about bodies. It's not about women or men. It's about a certain energy, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Or
a certain ethos.
Right.
Carol Gilligan, pretty well-known feminist, wrote a very famous book called In a Different Voice. And she talked about kind of different ethical sensibilities that exist between men and women. And it was a very successful book, but it was also one that was criticized because she didn't do a lot to say that these differences were just results of culture, which made people say, well, okay, so you're saying that there's just these natural differences. And so she had to sort of, like, as I remember it, kind of reconfigure her point of view. My response would be to say, no, there's probably some nature involved there, and that's okay. And we can also continue to look at how, these things are culturally produced. That's fine too. But there's nothing wrong with saying that there's a feminine ethos and a masculine ethos. There's a feminine style of thought and a masculine style of thought. And in each one of us, regardless of our sex, there's plenty of overlap there. Now, that type of thinking just feels so much more sane to me and ultimately more healing.
Yeah, I don't know much about Jung, and I haven't read much of Jung, but one of the ideas I do really like is that every human has the feminine and the masculine. We all have those aspects within ourselves. So I like that. I like, the yin-yang symbol to me is really powerful because you have the two, and then you have the opposites within the two, and it's all moving together,
I think if we could accept that type of idea, some of our thinking about gender and the way we're concretizing it would really shift. If we could really fully accept this idea of androgyny and not literalize it, but just accept the idea that we're all feminine, masculine, and masculine, feminine, and understand that not to mean that we are, kind of literally male or female and then not, it's just we're concretizing what is a metaphorical reality.
And of course, the other thing I think when it comes to linguistics is that we think it's the words that are creating, like you point out, but actually that if we change the words, the reality will still be there.
Yeah.
I think, at the moment, women are being called uterus havers or menstruators. but the reality is that even if we change the word woman to menstruators and everybody accepts that word, then they'll want to change that word because the reality can't be changed. Really, well, it can be a little bit maybe, but the underlying biological kind of thing that gives us life, that's going to stay there. We can keep changing the words all we want, but it won't matter. We're not the ones in control of that. Or something.
Right. And changing the words comes at a price. All of a sudden you're using these terms that don't really correspond or hook up with texts that were written just a few years ago, and you have to do these sort of mental gymnastics to understand what the heck's being talked about. In the English language, terms like male and female, woman and man, they have thousands upon thousands of years of associations and great works of art that were built around them and all these other things and all this wisdom of, religious and humanistic built around what those things are. And then now we're going to confuse it with these really sterile, forced terms like uterus haver and penis haver. And and it's hard to not respond to those with just kind of, rather crass jokes because, never thought of myself as a penis haver. It's like, what is that? Yeah.
Who knows what way it's going to go, I wonder.
Yeah.
But I better wrap it up. We have been speaking for an hour. Thank you so much for chatting to me. I think your book is extraordinary.
Well, thank you.
And really important. And if people get it, and I recommend they get it and they read it, obviously. Can you tell us what your next book is going to be about?
Then I will tell you the subtitle of the next book, which is Eternal Youth and the Myth of Deconstruction. So I am comparing Jacques Derrida and Judith Butler to the figure of the eternal youth. In mythology, eternal youth it's kind of like a Peter Pan figure, because I sense a lot of Peter Pan in Butler and Derrida. So
great. Okay, well I'll be buying it. That's for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
really
you
great.
so much, Colette. This has been great, and I feel like you've just placed me in a lineage of great guests because you've had on Jonathan Haidt and Helen Pluckrose. And when I saw that, I thought, oh my gosh, I love these people.
That was really good.
That's it for this episode of Spokes. You can find out more about Bret on his website aldermancoaching.com, and there are more details in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode of Spokes, please do check out our other recordings and drop a review or a rating, and of course don't forget to like and subscribe.
Come on, Bruno.
Spokes is produced by Colette Colfer and Terry Hackett.